Essentially, what we're talking about here is something called Pascal's wager, which is something that I never thought that I'd be talking about on the podcast. But it's an argument. It's a philosophical argument put forth by Pascal in the 17th century.
Hey, everybody. Before we start the show, I want to make a couple disclaimers. This show does cover a wide variety of topics related to mental health and life in general, and some of those could be sensitive for you. I want to simultaneously encourage you to be brave in consuming difficult content, but also respect and recognize your limitations. So please use your best judgment. I will never be offended if you need to skip a question or an episode entirely, but feel free to feel it out, check out the episode, and just see what happens. If you need to skip, that's okay, but feel free to give it a shot first. I also need to say that while I am a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist, and I'm not your therapist. This is not intended to be direct medical advice, and you should not use this as a substitute for professional help. So with those said, let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 355. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff, aka Duff the Psych. I make mental health content for real people just like you. And today I have a question and answer episode. 2 awesome questions from listeners like you. If you would like to send me in a question for the show, send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com or use the contact form on my website, which is just duffthepsych.com. And today there are, as I said, 2 questions. The second one does involve some discussion of suicide, but it is not specific. It's very theoretical, hypothetical, nothing that should be too triggering for anybody. So just want to make you aware of that. No sponsors today, so we'll just kind of get through the questions and roll through it. It's been an interesting day. Today was the last day of school for my kids. I have a kid in that just promoted from, TK to kindergarten. And then my other son went from first grade and he'll be going into second grade. But my little town that I live in had a total royal fuck up when it comes to the school system. And the person who was, in charge, I don't even know what the title is, school board, I guess, totally screwed the pooch on the budget and things like that. And there was $1 million deficit or some, I don't even know all the details of it. It kind of makes my head spin, but they basically had to make all these quick decisions about what to do to save money. And the school that they went to is just closing straight up. So there's these shirts that they made and, the yearbooks and stuff like that, where it's their elementary school, 1887 through 2023. And it's just this school is no longer going to be a school. They're going to turn it into a park or something like that. And everybody's got to go somewhere else. And so it's been a trip, very ominous and bittersweet and stuff. At the end of the year here, it's not just the end of the school year. It's the end of this school. So all the teachers are emotional and, some of the kids are, and it's just a weird feeling. But it's also been a really big celebration. So I've had so much damn cheap Domino's pizza over the past couple weeks between end of school activities and birthday parties and summer stuff. Oh boy. Not really in line with my cholesterol goals, but we're doing what we can here. Anyway, that was today. And now I have an opportunity to record this for you. So happy to be here. Hopefully wherever you are and whatever you're doing okay. Let's just get into it. Here's the first question. It reads, "Hi Duff, thank you for all that you do. My partner was diagnosed with ADHD in childhood. He's wondering if he also has bipolar II, because he will get depressed seemingly randomly, but it's also just so hard to tell if it's truly random or if it's caused by a situational factor that he just can't pinpoint. He doesn't have traditional manic episodes, but he's wondering if his good days are actually hypomanic episodes. I feel like these high moods are usually catalyzed by situational factors like hanging out with friends or accomplishing a goal, but he feels like they're random. Do you have any tips on distinguishing bipolar II from ADHD? So thank you for the question. This is a good one, and it's a very common question. I've seen this quite a few times, talked with people about it, in my clinical practices. And yeah, it's a good one because there are definitely some crossover behaviors between ADHD and bipolar or bipolar II. At the start here, I'll give you a little bit of terminology and reminders. So as a reminder, bipolar 2 is different than bipolar 1 in that it features hypomania. So hypomania is essentially a less severe and less impactful form of mania. So you still have similar behaviors. You still have an increase in impulsivity, creative energy, maybe really quick talking and excess energy, grandiosity, feeling like you could do anything. But with hypomania, it tends to be shorter in duration, though it can be long as well, but it can definitely just be a couple days. And it doesn't significantly impact the person's ability to function in daily life the way that full mania does. And then if there's anything like psychosis, where somebody is losing touch with reality, that automatically would qualify as, full-blown mania. So that's bipolar 2 and hypomania. Now, ADHD is the umbrella term for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And that includes everything. So people sometimes make this sort of false dichotomy between ADD and ADHD. ADHD is the technical diagnosis, and underneath that, you can have people who have primarily inattentive, so really hard time sustaining attention over a long period of time, controlling where their attention goes, or hyperactive, where you have impulsive behavioral patterns, you have trouble holding back behaviors, and maybe even just pure hyperactivity. And then you can also have both. You can have the combined type. So particularly for people who have, hyperactive ADHD, it can look pretty similar to bipolar 2 in a few different ways. Both hypomania and the hyperactive ADHD symptoms can cause somebody to behave in impulsive ways. This could be like rash decision-making, difficulty controlling impulses and holding back behaviors, and a lack of self-control. And somebody with ADHD or hypomania may also talk rapidly. So somebody with bipolar and mania or hypomania, they might have really, really quick thoughts. Their thoughts might seem to bounce from place to place. They have what's called pressured speech, where they're just kind of talking rapidly and they're just running on a motor. And it's overwhelming to people who aren't in the same kind of level. And you can definitely see that with ADHD as well. They can both lead to trouble focusing. They can both lead to trouble staying on task and getting things done. So as you can see, given just a quick snapshot of somebody, in one day where they're having these difficulties, they're really talking rapidly, they're bouncing off the walls, they're having trouble focusing, it can be pretty hard to tell the difference between hypomania and ADHD. But there are some key differences, so let's dive into some of the reasons why they're not exactly the same. First off, the consistency and duration of behavioral symptoms is important to consider. So ADHD is generally consistent and long-term. It doesn't vary a whole lot. Certainly you can have a bit of variation day to day, or there are certain situations that might worsen somebody's ADHD symptoms, but the primary symptoms don't come and go. They're always there unless we're talking about adding medication in and controlling them that way. But on the other hand, bipolar 2, that's going to feature these fluctuations between different mood states. You're going to have depression, which I think most people are pretty aware of what that looks like. You're going to have periods of relative normality where things are okay. And then you're going to have those hypomanic events where you're having those behaviors that I talked about a second ago that can kind of look hyperactive. So that means that when somebody with bipolar 2 is not actively hypomanic, they aren't necessarily going to be exhibiting those behaviors that look like ADHD. In fact, they might show the opposite type behaviors, right? Because they might be in a depressed mood state. So instead of showing ADHD-like behaviors, they're going to look low energy, lethargic, have slow speech, and things like that because they're depressed. And that variability in the length of those mood states, that's one key factor in telling the difference between the two, between ADHD and hypomania. Even when somebody with bipolar 2 exhibits these very ADHD-like behaviors, they're typically going to come out of that. They're going to get out of that mood state in a matter of days, whereas somebody with ADHD, that's not going to be the case. Now, with medications, people with ADHD are often prescribed stimulant medications like Ritalin or Adderall, and that can help them to control their attentional abilities, and it can also give them the power to inhibit their behavior. It's really interesting how it works. Our brains really work in a way that isn't the most common sense, meaning we actively inhibit a lot of things in our brain. So we essentially have systems that are designed to actively work to stop things from happening. And then we selectively let up that inhibition to allow behaviors to happen. And ADHD medication can give you more control over that. But that's not really what we're talking about here. Anyways, with the medication, somebody with ADHD on those stimulants may have better control of their attention, better control of their behavior. But if you give those same sorts of stimulants to somebody with bipolar II, rather than helping them calm down and focus, you might actually trigger a hypomanic event. That's the same with, say, SSRIs, things that are stimulants, certain medications like, say, Wellbutrin that are for depression but are very kind of stimulating and supposed to give you more energy. These are all things that could potentially trigger a hypomanic event. So the impact of that medication is going to be quite different depending on ADHD or bipolar II. So now that we've discussed some of the general similarities and differences between ADHD and bipolar II, let's talk about some of the specific questions you have here in this question about your partner. I think in his case, the duration of the mood events is important to consider. We've mostly talked about the hyperactive behaviors, but for depressive phases in the context of a mood disorder like bipolar II, these also are important to think about because depression tends to last for, say, 2 weeks or more. We aren't just talking about a random day-to-day fluctuation or, in the moment mood swings. Something like borderline personality disorder that I've talked about before, that can definitely cause this day-to-day fluctuation and strong emotional reactivity. But when you have a mood disorder like depression or bipolar that causes you to feel depressed, that's going to be more persistent. You can have a little bit of that fluctuation, but you're not going to be, completely pulling out of it and then going back in a matter of, minutes or hours. That said, there are some people that have more rapid cycling bipolar, but that's typically not what you're looking at. It sounds like for your partner, he has these short-term changes to his behavior and mood that last, a day or so. And those longer mood states that are caused by bipolar, I'm not really hearing here. You would also want to take a look at his good days, the things that he is exhibiting, and determine if they actually seem like mania or hypomania. Because somebody who may tend to be depressed, often they might feel great, amazing, maybe even a little bit euphoric when their depression lets up and they're able to engage with friends or start a new project. It's like, oh gosh, I can live my life again. That's not the same thing as experiencing those very specific manic symptoms that we talked about. I will say that it is very common for people who have ADHD to experience disruption in their mood. Psychiatric issues like depression and anxiety are very common. They very commonly co-occur with ADHD for a variety of reasons, one of which is the social aspect, and it's hard to have ADHD in a world that's, not really built for it. But yeah, they commonly co-occur. So it's totally reasonable to suspect that somebody with ADHD might be more sensitive to dips or elevations in mood as a quirk of their ADHD rather than, this mental health disorder like bipolar that causes these shifts in mood state back and forth. So I'd ask a few questions, right? When he's depressed, is he sort of just, blue and out of it and not very happy? Or is he totally non-functional? Is he lethargic and hopeless? And you can really, really, really tell that something is wrong. He's not functional in the same way that he used to be. On the flip side, when he's in a good mood, is he excited and a little hyper and maybe just kind of rambling? Or is he very difficult to be around because he's practically vibrating with energy and making these grandiose plans and, acting in ways that are not his normal self and they're maybe a little bit dangerous or embarrassing to be around, right? So really taking a look at the quality of his behaviors and thinking about what they fit with better. And bipolar II and ADHD can absolutely both exist in the same person. I know some people where that is the case. I'm not trying to say that they're completely different in that they're mutually exclusive, right? So it is possible that his instinct is correct, but from what you've described, it just doesn't sound like it in his specific case. If he'd really like to get some answers, I would have him talk to a psychiatrist or psychologist about it and see if maybe going through a thorough evaluation would be helpful. And if he doesn't have one, if he doesn't have a psychiatrist who manages medications for him or a psychologist that helps with the behavioral part, I would get on that as well, right? It sounds like he could use a little bit of help if he's concerned about this. regardless of the origin of his mood fluctuations, it does sound like he could use some help in coping with them. He also seems to have pretty little insight into why they might be happening. You two seem like you kind of disagree, where he thinks it's random and, it comes out of the blue, and you're saying, I don't know, it seems like it's pretty consistent with certain triggers. So having a third party, a professional, to dig into that with him and tease apart his experience could be really beneficial. The last thing that I'll mention here is that although mania and depression can happen somewhat randomly, they can also be responsive to what's happening in someone's life. So for example, somebody with bipolar II, they can randomly find themselves in a hypomanic phase at certain points in their life where they don't even realize it. It kind of comes out of nowhere and like, wow, okay, that just happened. But they might also be at higher risk of slipping into that mania when something is going on. So when they're stressed at work, or when they're sick, when a family member is sick, when they're not sleeping enough, during an election cycle or something like that. There are things that can make that more triggered than just the sort of random variability. So I hope that gives you some information to get started with. If I had to guess, I would say that for your particular situation with your partner, he likely has ADHD and maybe some mild mood issues rather than full bipolar II. But he could definitely talk to his providers about this and look into it more deeply if he wanted to. I also wanted to remind you and everybody who's interested in this sort of topic that I am well into my next book, which is all about bipolar. Let me pull it up and see how far I've gotten, because I've been working on it recently. I had a good opportunity to dive into it not long ago, and I made a lot of progress in terms of just getting extra words and pages in there. So let's see here. I'm up to almost 27,000 words. So I've definitely made some progress, and it's coming along. So the book is, right now I'm calling it Bipolar Answers. I'm not sure if that'll be the final title, but it's a book that's all about bipolar, and it features questions from this podcast. And in fact, if I find that I could flesh out the whole ADHD versus bipolar II question more, I'm going to include this one in there too, because this is a really good question. So in there, I have, question and answer format like the podcast here, but definitely expanded and more detailed. And it's still, in my approach, still very conversational, trying to make sure you understand in a straightforward way. And then I also have additional information boxes or charts and tables for quick reference. Even now that I've made significant progress, I find myself referencing my own book when I'm answering questions like this. So as I was sort of outlining this question, I pulled up my book to look at my own table about mania versus hypomania. But I also have things like borderline versus bipolar disorder, quick reference charts for the different symptoms involved in mania and depression, what psychosis looks like, anything where there's additional information that can be put in there. I've tried to put it in there in a way that is digestible and easy to reference. So if you want to follow along with that, I highly suggest, signing up for the email list or following me on social media so you can get the most recent updates. I just finished doing my letter. So in my anxiety and depression books, I have a letter to people that don't understand anxiety or depression, and those have gone over very well over the years. And so I'm also doing a letter to those who don't understand bipolar, and I just wrote that and shared it on my Facebook page, which got some really good feedback as well. So I'm feeling super encouraged, and I'd like to have it out before the end of the year. So, please follow along, and I'm excited about it. So thank you for the question. Really good stuff. Let's go ahead and get into the next one. So question 2, it reads, "Hi, nice to meet you." Actually, let me pause. This one, I don't think the person is a native English speaker, so there might be a little bit of fumbling around with the reading through it here. "Hi, nice to meet you. I've been struggling with the thought for a very long time. I've been constantly thinking about people who die by committing suicide. Even though I'm not a religious person, still, what if a God or Satan exist? What if anything as soul exists? And what if something bad is going to happen to them? What if the higher energy put them in hell and punishes them for ending their lives? Most of them would have committed suicide because they couldn't have the capacity to accept the bitter truths of life. What if the higher energy just deleted all their memories and gave them rebirth or reincarnation again? What if those souls are going to get liberation without getting their mental illness cured? I don't want any of these things to happen to their soul. Or what if something even bad or worse can happen to them? I know there's no evidence of any form of a God, Satan, or higher energy, but when I look at this universe and realize how perfect it all is, it's nearly impossible to deny the existence of any form of higher energy. So how to deal with this? Thank you for this. It's a super interesting question, and I don't think I've taken any questions like it on the show before. You're struggling with a philosophical question that's essentially as old as time. It's basically the what if of religion and spirituality. You might not see any evidence that there's a God or soul or an afterlife, but what if there is? Essentially what we're talking about here is something called Pascal's wager, which is something that I never thought that I'd be talking about on the podcast. But it's an argument. It's a philosophical argument put forth by Pascal in the 17th century. And it basically says that if you believe in God and live your life accordingly, and it turns out that God does exist, then you're in good shape. You get the rewards that come with that. If you believe in God and God does not exist, you really don't lose anything. Maybe you have some minor sacrifices in your life and it changes your lifestyle while you're here, but you don't lose anything in the end. However, if you act in a way that is not consistent with believing in God, and it turns out that God does exist, then you risk being screwed and punished in whatever way, that God sees fit. And then if you do not believe in God and God does not exist, similarly to the other one, you don't really lose anything there. So that's called Pascal's wager. And basically his argument is that it's more rational to behave in a way that would imply God exists, even if you don't actually believe it, right? So it's more rational to believe in God, even if there's no proof. And there are certainly criticisms of this, over the years, from, you can't really force yourself to believe in something that you don't actually believe, to, those, you don't lose anything by acting as if there is a God or something like that. There are definitely arguments that are against Pascal's wager. But that's kind of what we're talking about here. And a lot of this basically comes down to your own beliefs and theoretical framework. So I'll talk a lot about myself here because that's basically all I can do. Personally, I would consider myself to be agnostic in kind of the literal sense of the word. So agnostic, right? Gnosis meaning knowledge, ag meaning the lack of it. So lack of knowledge. So meaning I don't think that I can know if there's a God or not. I have no knowledge about that. If there is a God, I do not believe that it's a fair and just one, right? Because there's so much wrong that happens in the world. But I also think that it's impossible to know if there's a God given where we are at as humanity in the history of our evolution. So therefore, to me, it is, in my opinion, useless to spend a lot of time worrying about it or thinking about it or changing your behavior based on something that you don't actually know. In the end, I think that as humans, we are a very arrogant species. We're a very arrogant species of primate on a speck in the universe smaller than our minds can really comprehend. We can try to live a life that means something to us. We can connect with others. We can try to make a difference in the lives of others and in the world. But we really don't matter all that much, all things considered, right? In my personal philosophy, I think that these sorts of existential questions are interesting, but they can very easily distract from the actual impact you could make in the present as a human being living on the world right now. The next part of your question that doesn't really match with my personal philosophy is the assumption that bad things would happen to somebody that dies by suicide, because embedded in there is the assumption that they're doing something wrong. Right? So you're saying they would be punished. Why would they be punished? Where does that belief come from? I'm assuming that comes from religion, or at least the, societal impact of religion, living in a place where, religion has had influence. Why would you even think that in the first place? Personally, I don't think that there's anything morally wrong with somebody ending their life. That's just sort of in isolation. The very act of it, I don't think is immoral. I think that there are some circumstances where somebody is very clearly losing their opportunity to make changes and pursue a life that's worth living, where there are other options there. That's, why often I am talking with people about this in my practice. I've talked before on the show about sort of essentially as a psychologist being similar to a lawyer arguing on the side of life, because there are many situations where somebody is, experiencing depression symptoms that are convincing them that they're hopeless when they aren't actually. But to me, it's not as if they did something wrong morally simply because they ended their life. This gets more complicated when you consider the moral implications of how it might impact others. So if they have dependents or family, things like that. But I don't see why the simple act of suicide would be something that would be punished by a higher power, even if there was one. You mentioned at the end of your question that when you look at the universe and realize how perfect it all is, it's nearly impossible to deny the existence of a higher power. Again, I wouldn't really agree with that either. For one thing, humans suck at thinking in scale. As I said, we are so small that it's almost hard for us to even comprehend that. For many people, the concept of evolution doesn't sit right to them because it just doesn't make sense that, such small, gradual changes can lead to eventually the rise of human beings. Look at us. We're so perfect. But the thing is, that scale of time involved is so hard to wrap your head around, right? We're talking about so long. And yeah, even if it's these minute changes and so much chance, given enough time, things like evolution happen, right? So we just are not good at thinking in that way. To me, I think that if there is a God, them caring about what a single human does with their life would be like the owner of the largest zoo in the world being concerned about the fate of one single ant, right? So yeah, I just, we're so small. And that's even just when we're talking about humanity, even the existence of our planet, not even just humans. The existence of our planet is a blink in the cosmic timeline. There's so much more out there than us. So I think that, time is the way that you can rationalize why the universe and our world is so perfect. But really, is it perfect? Right? That depends on your definition. I think that the universe is chaotic and unfair and really ruthless at times. Maybe there's beauty and perfection in that, but, what does perfect really mean? I don't know. We could go down these rabbit holes endlessly. What matters to me more is, what are you doing with that concern? That's what I would want to direct you toward. I'm not going to be able to just, snap my fingers and make you stop feeling all these deep existential fears, but maybe I can push you to act in ways that are in line with the values that you have that make you so disturbed by these ideas, make you act in ways that could possibly make the world a better place or improve the lives of those that you have influence over or impact on. I also want to push you to expand your perspective on suicide and mental illness. You said the reason that people die from suicide is that they can't accept the bitter truths of life. I think that's a very narrow way of viewing it, right? I've met people that have been suicidal because their history is steeped in abuse and their entire worldview is built upon that foundation. I've met people who have been suicidal because they're impulsive and their brain generates intrusive thoughts and they just can't get rid of that. And it sounds like the best idea. I've met people who have been suicidal because no matter what treatment they receive, both conventional and non-conventional, we're talking TMS, ECT, ketamine, psilocybin, all the things, they just can't feel joy in their lives despite everything looking fine on the surface. They feel so unsettled. I've known people who are suicidal because they are extremely physically disabled and they don't enjoy their lives anymore, and there's no chance of them getting better from their physical disabilities. And I've known someone that did end their life because they had a brain injury that literally ripped away their ability to feel happiness. So there's a lot of different reasons for it. Perhaps this is a call for you to learn more, to get involved, and to see what you can do to be a support or a resource to these people that you're so concerned about before their time is up. I hope this doesn't come off as criticism or admonishing you. These are indeed really big and scary questions that many of us struggle with. But at a certain level, you can only do what you can do. The rumination may be somewhat unavoidable, that sense of anxiety and rolling around these questions in your head. But playing into it and really buying into your worries may not be very useful. So what can you do? That's what I want you to ask yourself about. So that's what I got to say about that. This is a very philosophical question, much more than other questions on the show. If you have any feedback for me, please feel free to send it over. But this is the end of the episode. I appreciate you guys listening. This has been episode 355 of the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. If you want to send me a question for the show for a future episode, shoot me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com. If you'd like to review the show, please consider doing so on whatever platform you use to listen to the podcast. And if you'd like the show notes, go to duffthepsych.com/episode 355. Take really good care of yourselves. I appreciate you so very much, and I will see you for the next episode. Bye.